Good evening and welcome. My name is Johnny Burtka. I'm the president of ISI and the publisher of Modern Age Journal. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion this evening on the topic of Yoram Hazony's new book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. After the event, we will actually have signed copies of both Yoram Hazony's book and Matt Continetti's book available for you in the back of the room if you want to pick up one of those. For those of you who are new to ISI, ISI was founded in 1953 to educate the next generation of American leaders in the principles of ordered liberty, the glories of Western civilization, and to instill an appreciation for the American constitutional order in the next generation. We host about 150 events, lectures, debates, and seminars around the country each year for college students, for graduate students, for faculty members, and for our community of alumni. And I see many alums in the room tonight, so thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, we have Modern Age Journal, which is our flagship conservative quarterly publication of ideas. And tonight we have the privilege of hearing those ideas leap off the page and be in person right here in the heart of Washington, D.C. First and foremost, I would like to thank Ambassador Louise Oliver and Daniel Oliver for sponsoring the event this evening. And I will introduce Ambassador Oliver, who will set the stage for tonight's remarks. Ambassador Louise V. Oliver served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization from February 2004 to January 2009. As the mother of 5 children, Ambassador Oliver has always had a strong interest in education. During the Reagan administration, she worked at the Department of Education after serving in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel. Her most important educational involvement, however, was serving as chairman of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute from 1993 to 2002. During that period, she oversaw a tremendous growth in the organization, including the acquisition of ISI's headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. Ambassador Oliver graduated with distinction from Smith College and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. She is married to Daniel Oliver, former chairman of the Federal Trade Commission during the Reagan administration and former executive editor in the 1970s of National Review magazine and longtime sailing and skiing companion of William F. Buckley, Jr. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Oliver.
Thank you, Johnny, for that kind introduction. It is, of course, a great pleasure and a great honor to be here tonight, as it was a great pleasure and a great honor to serve as chairman of the board of ISI for all those years. And in fact, tonight is making me feel rather nostalgic, I have to say. In his new book, The United States in Crisis, Edward Erler writes, and I quote, "In the postmodern world, the nation-state is under attack everywhere as a source of every imaginable evil. It is said to be the cause of war, selfishness, racism, white privilege, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and all the other so-called irrational phobias that make up the universe of political correctness. It is also said in the same quarters that the concept of the nation-state itself is irrational and arbitrary," end quote. Absolute nonsense, Mrs. Thatcher might have said. Nonsense indeed. But times are changing, as we will see this afternoon. Not since the earliest days of the conservative movement in 1953, as Johnny said, when the Intercollegiate Studies Institute was founded, 1955, when National Review was started, has there been a livelier debate about the meaning and direction of conservatism. The debate is not just about Donald Trump, despite what the Washington Post or CNN would have you believe. It's a debate about ideas, ideas such as fusionism, the legacy of Ronald Reagan, and America's role in the world. It's a debate about a new, or perhaps rediscovered, philosophy on the right, national conservatism. It's now being said that the late Frank Meyer was to fusionism what Yoram Hazony is to national conservatism. In his 2018 book, The Virtue of Nationalism, it called on Americans to recognize the deep morality of the nation state and defend the very idea of nationhood against ideological attack from both the multicultural left and the wrong-headed right. National conservatism has not only galvanized political thought in our country, it has led to a meeting of minds across the Atlantic, with Dr. Hazony organizing forums on national conservatism in Rome and Brussels. These forums are needed in order to combat the concept of global citizenship that is so popular in so many countries. Even at UNESCO, where I served as a US ambassador for 5 years, there was opposition to the very idea of independent states, despite the fact that UNESCO is itself an organization of sovereign independent states. But now, a rebirth of nationalism seems to be transforming politics across the globe. And in America, national conservatism means a new approach to world affairs, emphasizing burden sharing among allies and the needs of national economy, not just global efficiency. Now Hazony's new book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, calls conservatives to understand the roots of their nation's conservatism and its form of conservatism more clearly. Dr. Hazony rejects the contention that liberalism is America's only tradition, and therefore the only thing that conservatives can conserve. Instead, he points to a deeper tradition of Anglo-American constitutionalism. He recognizes that for most of its history, to the extent that America should be called a democracy, it has been a Christian democracy, not a liberal democracy. Not everyone on the political right may agree. Matthew Continetti has just published a book that documents a variety of conservative thought over the last century. His book, The Right, bears an appropriately sharp subtitle, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. A major power in that war for the past half-century has been the Heritage Foundation. Long identified with the mainstream of conservative thought, Heritage today has a leader who confronts the apparent divergence of that stream into many separate torrents. As president of the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Kevin Roberts has proved to be an adept navigator and captain. Is conservatism in need of rediscovery? Have we preserved the name but lost the idea itself? And if so, was that loss an accident? Or did it come about through the victory of the wrong kind of thought on the right? As we consider those questions, we must also ask whether conservatives can come together again, not just in a reaction to the excesses and failures of the left, but as a movement with a clear purpose and vision for the country. Our panel today consists of 3 thinkers who actively confront the difficulties and discern the promise of the 21st century right. Facilitating this conversation as moderator will be Daniel McCarthy, editor-in-chief of ISI's Modern Age. Since its founding by Russell Kirk in 1957, Modern Age has been a forum in which the greatest minds of the right have convened. Now we bring the conversation out of the journal's pages and into the heart of the nation's capital. And here to moderate the discussion is Dan McCarthy.
Thank you, Ambassador Oliver. I'm truly honored to be here moderating this panel with 3 of the best minds, the sharpest minds that American conservatism has produced in the 21st century. And all of you are here to have kind of a historic discussion, I think, as we look at national conservatism, as we look at the rediscovery of conservatism that Yoram Hazony has embarked upon in his books, as we look at the history of the right over the last century, which is so well documented by Matthew Continetti in his new book, and as Dr. Kevin Roberts talks to us about the way in which heritage has created a sort of new momentum for not just, the ideas with which conservatives have been familiar for a long time, but also for the kinds of policies that America needs most in the 21st century. That there's a real sense of liveliness right now among the mind of the right and among, indeed, the activist organizational muscle of the right. And so today's conversation should be quite an eye-opener for everyone. And I thought we'd begin, actually, with a rather a personal angle to conservatism, because I know in the new books, both by Dr. Hazony and by Matthew Continetti, there are fascinating chapters about their own journeys to conservatism. And Dr. Roberts has spent, a considerable amount of time leading a think tank in Texas before he came to Washington, D.C., and to Heritage. So I'd like to begin, gentlemen, by asking you about how it is that you came to understand yourself as a conservative and what conservatism means to you. And we'll start with Yoram.
I did write a chapter about it, so, and now I bet you're going to want me to be brief. Well, I grew up in the house of a physicist. My father he had opinions about absolutely everything, and he didn't read books or conservative magazines, and he didn't recommend any to me. But I had an uncle who signed me up when I was 15 to receive Commentary magazine. And Commentary magazine, George Will's essays, those were the first things that shaped my thinking politically. That's where I found myself cheering. When Ronald Reagan came on the scene, I went to my father and I said, "Dad, he believes everything you believe." And I sort of proudly brought Reagan to my father's attention, and it turned out that he did believe pretty much everything my father believed. I became so enthusiastic about Reagan and conservatism that when I went to university as a freshman, I and my friends, including my future wife, who is the subject of that chapter at the end of the book to a very large degree, we traveled to New York to Irving Kristol's Institute for Educational Affairs, and we asked for, that was my first fundraising trip, we asked for support to start a conservative magazine on the Princeton campus, the Princeton Tory, which is still being published today. The one thing I'll say about this conservative revival that was taking place at Princeton in those years was that when people look back at the Reagan-Thatcher years today, they often think of the Reagan-Thatcher movement as though it were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively about individual liberties and economic freedoms. And of course that was crucial, but the revival at Princeton that was sparked by Reagan and Thatcher, by these enthusiastic Reagan and Thatcher supporters, was very largely a religious and nationalist movement. Economics played, was an important part, but it was probably the third of the three. And so we had all of these Protestants, Catholics, and Jews returning to their roots as part of a personal desire to help make their nation great again. That was a Ronald Reagan slogan. I had that poster on my wall during the campaign in 1980. Reagan, let's make America great again. So that, and even the main thinkers that we read, I think the most important were Irving Kristol and George Will. But Irving Kristol, people don't remember that Irving Kristol was two cheers for capitalism, and Irving Kristol thought that religion, nationalism, and economic growth is what conservatism about, those three things, but he put religion first, and he said it was the most important. So I came to conservatism as part of a very different movement. I think that in those days, most of us just thought, as Crystal did, that that religion, nationalism, and economic growth was the combination. Somewhere along the line, I think that religion and nationalism have kind of dropped out. And that's, I think, really what we're here to discuss tonight.
So, Matthew, I know that your book opens with a discussion of your time in the early 2000s in kind of the nerve center, the epicenter of so much of the pulse of conservatism at that point in the early Bush administration. Can you tell us a bit about your conservative journey and what it was like back then?
Sure. My father was not a physicist. He worked in the family car business. And somehow the Italian diaspora, there's one little dot that ended up in Old Town Alexandria. And I'm related to everyone in that dot. So my father sold cars, and then my mother was a public school teacher. We were not a very political household. There was a very basic patriotism. So I'm a little bit younger than Yoram, but I do have memories of in fact, my first memory is of the Challenger explosion. And then so I was also able to witness the fall of the wall and kind of the heights of American power in the Gulf War. I attended the Victory Parade here in Washington, which is why I never got overly concerned when Trump wanted his parades, because I had gone to a parade as a 10-year-old, and I really liked that. But it was not very political. And I arrived at Columbia's campus as, I would say, basically kind of a milquetoast centrist. Columbia made me a conservative, but not in the way that I think many conservatives are formed, by a reaction to the overwhelmingly politically correct atmosphere of the university. Columbia made me a conservative by forcing me to read the great books of Western thought. And I remember in fact, I know the moment exactly, when I came upon the passage in the Republic during my sophomore year when Socrates and Thrasymachus discuss the nature of justice and what it means to be a slave. And it is introduced there is the idea that human beings can become slaves to their own appetites. And it hit me with a shock. And I came away from that reading with an understanding of humanity as that crooked timber, right, out of which no straight thing can be made. And I think that is the essential conservative insight. And so throughout that year, reading Aristotle and learning moderation, mixed regime, going on to reading Hobbes, Locke, then the Federalist, reading Smith, Burke, that was the good stuff. And by the end of that sophomore year, I was a conservative, philosophical conservative. And I was unaware that any of this around us existed. I had no idea of this conservative movement. I came upon National Review as an accident after I had read all of these texts. And so I discovered the conservative movement that way. And then at the beginning of my junior year, the 9/11 attack occurred. And that kind of reinvigorated this sense that the world is a lawless place, and American power is necessary, in my view, to get some degree of safety and order in the world. So by the end of my junior year, I was a conservative, and I happened to want to be a writer all my life. But in college, I realized that I would not be the next Stephen King. And so journalism is the next best thing, because at least you get a paycheck. And so conservative journalism it was. And that's how I ended up working at the Weekly Standard for many years before moving on to other things.
So, Kevin, I think people are very familiar with Heritage, of course, as the brain trust from which Ronald Reagan drew so much of his talent. But an institution like Heritage needs renewal over time. And you've stepped in the past year as the new head of Heritage. Tell us a bit about how you were formed as a conservative and what conservatism means in your context.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you for being here. My story, which I'll try to relate as succinctly as possible, starts in a working class family in Louisiana, in a context in Reagan's era that even though in the rest of the country was prospering economically, because we were an oil and gas family, and by that I mean roughneck oil and gas family, not white collar oil and gas, we felt the economic and even social ravages of the oil bust of 1983. And so my family was conservative, but I was the first Republican in my family, because the theme that runs through the 3 episodes I'll relate briefly is an increasing appreciation of the importance of institutions. Politics, very important. Policy, important. Policy analysis, very important. The work of all the organizations represented here, important. But ultimately, for me as a conservative, I learned as my family was having to leave Louisiana with no money up to Northern Virginia in the mid and late 80s, that government, regardless of the intentions of the war, so-called war on poverty, was at best reactive to those things, and that what was going to get my family and other families through those episodes were institutions, our churches, our mediating institutions of civil society, as academics like to call them. So that was very formative for me, and therefore, when in the 90s, I was president of my college's College Republicans, and Newt Gingrich and the contract with America became ascendant, I understood that that was important politically. But for me, as a historian and a history nerd going back to when I was 9 or 10, I realized that Newt, and I would say it's true to this day about him and his movement, marked the flip in the conservative movement from what my family, lifelong Democrats, called Rockefeller Republicanism to real Americanism. And I don't mean that pejoratively toward people who would be in that former wing, but it is also, we now know, in hindsight, that's what was happening, among other things. But the third thing that happened was, after I got my doctoral degree in early American history and understood things academically, intellectually, remained a conservative Republican in spite of going to a pretty left-of-center university and department, that for cradle Catholics, something we call a reversion to the faith started the day John Paul II died. And this comes full circle, I promise you, because I'm a son, as looking around the room, many of us are, of the triumvirate of Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II. And one need not be a Catholic to represent that what John Paul II was saying was, yes, we're going to fight totalitarianism, we are going to fight economic injustice, centralization, but we're also going to have the courage to say that we're going to rebuild society in his image. And for me, having been president of a small Catholic college that was born out of John Sr.'s integrated humanities program at Kansas, where there's the death of Christian culture, but then the rebirth of it if we're willing to embrace it, I think that that's why I'm so optimistic about conservatism, is that we've come back to our roots. Politics will always be ugly. We're going to go through recessions, maybe even economic depressions. We don't wish that, but it's going to happen. We have to lean into building institutions, whether they be clearly in the public square like ours are, or whether they're not so clearly in the public square, but still very much part of it.
So Kevin alluded to Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Pope John Paul II, and those are certainly names that people would identify with conservatism. But Yoram, your book is called Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and I'm curious, what has to be rediscovered about conservatism? What is it that people don't already know about the right?
Well, look, I think there's two kinds of people: the kind of people who can see that America and the democratic world is desperately on the wrong course, and those who can't. And for those of us who see that the course is and has been one of dissolution for the last couple of generations, it's important to ask why. Now, I should add that I think that if you talk to the average 25-year-old in Washington who is working in some way or another in the sort of broader policy think tank, Capitol Hill world, I think that average 25-year-old probably reads an awful lot of thinkers who are, let's say, from the fringes of the right. I'm not saying that they're convinced by them, but there are all of these thinkers who are saying, look, not just liberalism is finished, but the American Constitution is finished. The Christianity is finished. and Judaism never even got started. And I think those of us who are older, we have to be responsible to understand that this is happening among our young, those who we'd like to influence, those who we'd like to continue in our path. And what they are saying all the time is, what is conservatism conserved? I mean, they say this cynically. It's a question that's, on the one hand, it's kind of meant to wound, but on the other hand, it's meant sincerely. They're saying, listen, you older conservatives that have been in charge of all of this for the last 2-3 generations, what's left of what there was? What really is left? And I think we'd better answer that question, because I think that if we take the question seriously, as I tried to do in my book, if we take that question seriously and we follow the trajectory of the disappearance of God in Scripture, and the idea of the independent nation, the idea of the traditional family, and finally, sort of most dramatically and garishly, the disintegration of the idea that there are men and women, and there's no end in sight. There's no end in sight. If we look at that trajectory coldly, I think that we have to say that the ability to conserve and transmit, which gives conservatism its name, is really something that we all have failed at to a very, very significant degree. Now, it wasn't always like this. There was a Christian religion that succeeded for 2,000 years, a Jewish religion which succeeded for 3,000 years, maybe succeeded a little less though. But it was able to transmit and to conserve and transmit for hundreds of generations. We used to know how to do these things. And the Anglo-American constitutional tradition it's 1,000 years old. It's 1,000 years old. We used to know how to conserve and transmit. And what needs to be rediscovered is what kind of philosophy, what kind of framework, what kind of thought, what kind of life, what kind of way of living allows that transmission to take place. Because whatever it is, we'd better find it real fast, or there isn't going to be much left to conserve.
So Matthew, you have taken a long view of conservatism with a book covering 100 years. What is happening to the right today, and is it unprecedented in the history of American conservative thought?
I don't think it's unprecedented. I think that when you look at the history of the right, you see that it's always been divided over certain key questions, that there's always been dissenting traditions when we look at the economy, at the role of government, when we look especially at the nature of American engagement in international relations. And so when I subtitle my book, The War for American Conservatism, I'm referring to this ongoing conversation among conservatives and different factions of the right over what attitude the movement and then American public policy should take toward these crucial issues. So this is a constant throughout the 100 years, and you're going to have to buy a copy to get all of the details. I will say, though, that a few things have happened in the last generation that have made all of these questions much more live, and also the argument about them much more intense. And I'll just tick off a few of them. One was the failures of the George W. Bush administration. The second term of George W. Bush was one of the least successful terms of any president in American history. It begins with a fundamental misunderstanding of why George W. won re-election. The election was won in 2004 because memories of 9/11 trumpeted public discontent with the conduct in the war in Iraq. And the public, the electorate, was not willing to turn to the Democrats especially not willing to turn to John Kerry for American national security. There was another reason too, which was that in particular in Ohio, George W. Bush stressed the issue of a constitutional amendment to limit marriage to one man and one woman, okay? So you have national security and traditionalism. What does George W. Bush begin his second term with? Social security reform, which had not been litigated in the campaign. And then he moves on to comprehensive immigration reform, which he had always believed in and always been an advocate for, but had never truly understood the opposition to that idea among the populist grassroots right. Then what happens? Well, the Iraq War starts going south quickly. And we have Hurricane Katrina. What's Bush's response to Hurricane Katrina? Massive government spending. So whatever credibility he had remaining with limited government conservatives was erased. The war continues to get even worse in 2006 and 2007. And so we have simmering discontent with the Republican and conservative establishment over issues of national security, immigration, and then a larger kind of identity question of who is George W. Bush representing in office, right? Is it the populist right that helped him get into office in 2000 and stay there in 2004? Or is it other interests? And this culminates in the financial crash in the final months of George W.'s second term, in which the issue of not only limited government comes to be seen as or the illegitimate, or the establishment's position on this issue is delegitimized by the bailouts of the banks. But larger political questions of political economy also come to the fore, because during this recovery, or the very slow recovery in the ensuing decade, Americans are confronted with the ramifications of China's entry into the international economic arena. So as a result of all of these pressures, conservatism has to renegotiate its stance on a variety of issues: national security, immigration, economic protection, the nature of the relationship between the elite and the populace, right? And then intensifying all the debates is social media, which does not come in really into play in George W.'s terms, more Obama's term. But I don't know if you've noticed, but social media is not conducive to civil debate. And so that has added to the antagonism on the right in these questions. But from a broad perspective, the answer to your question is we've always been arguing about these things. And in some ways, our positions now on these crucial issues resemble the right's positions on these issues prior to the Cold War. But the debates are old, the technology is new, and that, I think, has made some of these relationships very tenuous and sometimes irreparable.
We've certainly seen conservatism very effectively address the situation in the Cold War, followed by a period after the Cold War where conservatives often had electoral success, or at least Republicans did, in 1994, and with George W. Bush being elected and then re-elected. And yet, as you've just said, there was this sense, perhaps at the end of the Bush era, that conservatism had lost its way philosophically. So I'd be very interested to hear from Dr. Roberts. What needs to be rediscovered about conservatism today? What's the sort of 21st century vision of conservatism?
Great question. I spent the last week, a good part of the last week, reading both Yoram's book and Matt's book. And by the way, you should buy the book. They've not paid me to say that yet. But you really, all kidding aside, you should. They're different kinds of books, but they're really important. And I'm not saying that merely to be polite. They're really good, but reading those in the last week kind of reminded me of being in graduate school, where you got to read these long books pretty quickly, but they're gripping. But to your question, Dan, what I would say first and foremost, and I know that Heritage has been in the news a little bit the last several weeks about stating this explicitly, we all love the free market. But the free market is at the service of the family and at the service of the nation. And for a generation, going back to my comment about what happened between the Reagan years and the Gingrich Revolution and a little beyond, is that we recognized that we had that out of order, which is not to be dismissive toward free market behavior or people in our movement who still believe that the free market is preeminent. I think by having conversations like this, we can understand the proper place. So a future conservatism, actually a very present conservatism, if you think about how the misunderstanding of the free market is used as a cudgel against the institutions that are so important, we really have to come to grips with that as a movement. We have to be willing to have challenging conversations as a conservative family. We do that every day inside Heritage because of the nature of our one voice policy. We need to use technology as a tool rather than as a cudgel, especially on that point, because that gets us nowhere, and all it does is let the left, whose pace of changing, reordering the very definition of the human person, accelerates by the week. That leads me to the second point. We have to recognize as conservatives, going back to Matt's excellent point about President Bush winning Ohio and therefore winning the 2004 election on the issue of marriage, but forsaking it. And then, and I say this with all due respect of him personally and politically, forsaking it as a leader of the movement, period. That abandoning the field on social issues broadly has contributed mightily to the problem we're in. It doesn't mean that every single member of the conservative movement has to have that as their number one issue that they're activists on, but we ought to, as a movement, understand that the left is, as we sit here, redefining the human person, and there are too few of us calling them out on it. And that leads me to the third and final point. I think Yoram is not only right about this, but has hit the bullseye on it in his book, and it is the role of faith. What troubles me the most, even as an optimist, is that each year when Pew comes out with their very good study in terms of the methodology, which assesses the religiosity of Americans, that the percentage of Americans who identify as having no religious affiliation, not going to any kind of church service even once a week, increases. That is a problem, not only for conservatism, but for Americanism. And that's a problem we're not going to solve politically and not going to solve in terms of policy, which is why, if anything, I'm hopeful that what we're doing at Heritage, building on our great foundation there, I don't mean that in an arrogant way with institutional hubris, that we're spending as much time helping to rebuild institutions as we are in the very obvious policy fights we were meant to be engaged in.
So Yoram, your book draws a clear distinction between liberal democracy and Christian democracy. But as Kevin has just said, we see a rise in religious disaffiliation among Americans, and immigration has also introduced into our country more people from backgrounds that are neither Christian nor Jewish. So is America still religious enough? Is it still perhaps even Christian enough to be conservative, or do conservatives need to have a new vision or a new approach in an America that may be less religious or much more religiously fragmented?
Well, I definitely think that you're seeing it correctly. I mean, it's very difficult to argue with the reality of declining concern for religion in America and throughout the West. I think that in practice, what that means is that any kind of hope of imitating the left and seizing power throughout the United States and through an assault on the Supreme Court and the Congress and the presidency, I think that's at this point impossible. I mean, who knows, but I think it's impossible. And so I think a more modest strategy might be the best one. The United States was founded as a federal republic. The United States, at its infancy, had many different experiments in different kinds of relationships between church and state, including established churches. And I think that the restoration that we're talking about is going to have to come through the states, meaning it's not until 1947 that the idea of liberal democracy gets as far as a Supreme Court decision which rules out rules separation of church and state to be America's constitutional heritage and imposes that on all the states. 1947 is a long time ago, but it's also not that long ago, and as these things go. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the idea that somehow Americans would be better off if prayer and Bible were excluded from the school system. That's not till the 1960s. There's basically been 60 years of that taking place in the United States. And the conservative movement, we don't actually know what's going to happen with the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade, but especially if the Supreme Court does send that extremely important issue back to the states to be adjudicated by democratic processes, that would certainly be, I know that there are people who say that it's not a precedent for anything, but speaking just between me and the 200 of you here and the home viewing audience, that would actually be a very significant precedent, because the idea of returning important family, religious, social issues to the states for adjudication through the democratic process instead of fiat from the High Court, that could in fact have a great new awakening in America as a consequence of a decision of this kind. And how that affects religion, in my view, people should be talking about now. Catholics, Protestants, and Jews and others, Hindus, Muslims, should be talking about if we were to have the mandate given back to us at the state level to rethink separation of church and state. I think that the way to look at it is to say every society has a framework, a public philosophy or a public religion. Every society has one. And the public philosophy, the public religion of the United States was in fact Christian up until the Second World War. And it was replaced by a kind of de-Christianized liberalism after the Second World War, and that lasted for 2 generations. In the year 2020, that new liberal order, I think, basically collapsed, is no longer hegemonic, and now we have woke neo-Marxism making its bid. Conservatives should be asking themselves, what kind of public philosophy can we put forward as an alternative? Because you can't beat a public philosophy without an alternative. And I think that alternative has to be some kind of revisiting the tradition of Christian public life and the Christian moral vision and the biblical inheritance as the framework, as the basic framework for life in some of the states where it's possible, where there are Christian majorities, or where there are pro-Christian majorities. People who are willing to go into coalition with Christians because the alternative is so clear and it's so awful. It's right there in front of us. So let's revisit it and use this, this brilliant mechanism of federalism, which has been moribund for many decades. Use it in order to experiment and hope that those Americans who are still committed to some kind of biblical vision of public life, that they can come up with something that is tolerant and is decent and is going to work better than anything that we've seen, so that the people who are saying, "Oh, it's going to be like Iran," will be proven wrong, and something good and beautiful will come out of it. If that's not possible, so we'll have to let the far left take their vision forward.
So we have religion, the nation state, the people, and also universal ideas. Conservatives have oftentimes framed their philosophies or framed their approach to politics in terms of one or a combination of these three things: religion, nation, and universal values such as those of the Declaration of Independence. Matthew, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how conservatives have, over the last century, navigated these three quite distinct, kind of centers of philosophical impetus.
Sure. It's interesting when you mention the universal principles, Dan. The first thing I go to is the influence of the Austrian economists on the American right. And so if you look at the work of Ludwig von Mises, it was entirely deductive. He had axioms, he had his praxeology, everything flowed from these ideas that were universally applicable. And in many ways, his fellow Austrians, most prominently Friedrich Hayek, also thought in universal terms. These economic laws applied everywhere, and in fact, they scaled up. They scaled up globally, right? That's the title of one of the books about them, Globalists. So that tradition has existed on the American right since the 1920s, when Mises was writing his books, and they were translated in English in the 1930s. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, published in England in 1944, translated in 1945, becomes a runaway bestseller in a Reader's Digest abridgment, actually edited by a former communist named Max Eastman, who it was converted to the right by Hayek. Not the only former communist converted by Hayek. Well, that coexists with traditionalism, the type of conservatism that Yoram writes so eloquently about in his book. And there you have a rejection of universal principle and a reliance on prescription and small p prejudice, right? And that's represented with the tradition of Russell Kirk in his great book, The Conservative Mind, published in 1953. So these two poles, liberty and tradition, have always been in tension and sometimes in cooperation on the American right. What's interesting is the second person I thought of when you said universal principle was the political philosopher Harry Jaffa. Harry Jaffa, and in his work, also published in the 1950s, Crisis of the House Divided, was instrumental in turning conservative intellectuals toward the idea of universal principle of political philosophy. If you asked Russell Kirk about the Declaration of Independence, he would say, no, 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 no. Let's talk about the Constitution. The Declaration is dangerous. Harry Jaffa says, no, the Constitution is the institutionalization of the principles of the Declaration, and the idea of human equality, universal human equality, is something conservatives need to be behind. And this struggle plays out in the pages of the conservatives' most important journal, the National Review. By 1976, 1977, it is a fascinating turn. National Review and its editor, William F. Buckley Jr., adopts Jaffa's idea of universal political equality as a basis of conservatism. And this structures, I think, the right's view on many of these questions for decades. What's fascinating is there's been a turn away from that. Even as, in many ways, Jaffa is at, I mean, he died a decade ago, but in many ways, he's at the height of his influence. I don't see the right actually turning to the idea of universal principles of human equality as much as they did when he was fighting it out in the pages of small magazines.
So, Kevin, you alluded to the difficulties that conservatism might face as religious affiliation changes in our country. I wanted to ask you about something that Ambassador Oliver talked about, which is that the very idea of the nation and the nation state has also become controversial in our country, or certainly in our media and academy in recent years. How should conservatives look at nationalism, the nation state, and America as a nation and not just a collection of either all victims or all just market participants?
Gosh, in a lot of ways, that's the question in a conversation that's already had a lot of the questions. But to be really clear, I think that is a defining characteristic of conservatism now and moving forward. And just to complement Yoram in his book, and I know this is Matt's understanding as well, that we forsake fighting for nationalism, fighting for the concept of the nation state as conservatives at our peril. I won't use the overused word existential, but it is at our peril. And the reason is that Jaffa was right. That is both the aim and the mechanism, if you will, if we think about federalism, by which we achieve the program, the political and policy program we want to implement. And Yoram was also, I think, spot on when he invoked the importance of the states as doing that. The good thing about American history, and this is coming from this Southerner, is that we have dealt with the legacy of the Civil War. By that, I don't just mean the huge human achievement in human history of understanding the equality of the races and implementing that. That is one of the most noble achievements since the first man and woman walked on this planet. And we don't talk about that enough as conservatives. That's our achievement. Martin Luther King's moving speeches, one of the greatest speeches in human history, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in this town, that's our inheritance. That's our promissory note that we wrote in the 1780s to fulfill, as Jaffa would remind us, the beautiful, noble concepts of the Declaration of Independence. You can't have that, this is the point, without the nation state and without nationalism. And then secondly, and I'll stop here before I get even more wound up, is we have to have, and hopefully you see it in my body language as conservatives, a hostility toward global elites, especially those meeting at the World Economic Forum right now.
So we will start taking questions from the audience in just a few minutes. We have a microphone here. I'll have one of the ISI staff from the table stand by the microphone, and then if people want to start lining up, they can do so. Before we do that, however, you can line up now, but I'm going to ask one last question of the panel. Fusionism is a term that certainly many people in this town are familiar with, and it's often equated through a three-legged stool in which conservatives are said to defend free markets and sort of social virtues, social conservatism, and a strong foreign policy, a strong defense, which oftentimes may be a rather interventionist foreign policy under some interpretations. So I'm curious, is fusionism still the way that conservatives should look at their tradition, or is there a time for a kind of fissionism or some sort of change in the way in which conservatives conceive their philosophy? Yoram?
Fusionism has at least one spectacular success. It did, in fact, this alliance of liberals and conservatives on the right, called Fusionism from the 1960s, did, in fact, fuel the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, the defeat of the Soviet Union and communism abroad, and and rolling back socialism in American Britain and in other countries for an entire generation. So that ain't small stuff. But at the same time, I think that that the way that fusionism was constructed ended up, in retrospect, being unsuccessful. Fusionism is it's an alliance between liberals or libertarians and conservatives or traditionalists, depending on what you want to call them. That alliance was constructed in the 1960s consciously to give liberalism freedom, individual freedom, the public face of fusionism, whereas conserving and transmitting was a private matter for families and for schools. I think that fusion has completely failed. I think that what is not honored in public ends up not being honored in private. And what that means is that eliminating the God and religion and the independent nation, eliminating them from the forefront of the public mind and the public discussion, eliminating them from what you taught children in schools, and leaving that for the family and the churches, that failed. And what we need as we rethink conservatism is a new ordering of the relations among things in which the central role that is played by, now I want to be careful, I'm not talking about government bureaucracy. I'm talking about the simple fact that when Donald Trump is the president of the United States, tens of millions of people in America and around the world start to talk and think like Donald Trump, and you can't deny it. And when Barack Obama is president of the United States, tens of millions of people start to talk and think like Barack Obama. There is a vast impact that the political level has on the public culture and on the private lives of citizens, and understanding that will require us to rethink the public sphere so that it can support the private sphere in its crucial work of conservation and transmission.
Matthew, who was Frank Meyer, and what did he mean by fusionism?
You anticipated my answer. So Frank Meyer was an ex-communist, another converted by Hayek, who became very important to National Review. He's forgotten today. He died relatively early in 1972 of cancer, and I think that was a great loss to conservatism then and now. I think it's important to understand that when Frank Meyer was talking about what was called fusionism, it wasn't something he was theorizing or constructing. He viewed it as something he was describing. And in his original essay, he's actually responding to people who are extreme libertarians saying that they're wrong about the necessity of a standing army and a permanent defense establishment. He's saying, look, in this conservative coalition that has developed since the Second World War, there are traditionalists and that there are libertarians. And they seem, although different, they seem to be working in concert because they have the same enemy. And the enemy is centralized government, which in its most totalitarian expression is the Soviet Union. But then we can see in the centralized bureaucracies of the welfare state why libertarians would object to economic coercion and traditionalists would object to the state's interference in the family, the church, the community, right? So he's saying this is the alliance that I'm describing. He then makes a philosophical claim that is controversial at the time and continues to be, which he leaps to that and says the only true virtue is uncoerced. Let's leave that aside for a moment. That's above my pay grade. That's Yoram's job. I will say that the idea of fusionism being a description rather than a political philosophy of the nature of virtue is still very important to the right today. We need to think of the right and of the conservative movement as a coalition. And it needs to be a wide coalition, or else there is no way for the right to get into power in order to affect public policy in positive ways. And so what Meyer was doing there was describing a coalition. And I think to many degrees that coalition still exists, right? I think that the dangers of centralized bureaucracy are still real, right? I think that the third element of the triad that Yoram mentioned earlier, economic growth, is still a necessity, right? And I also think, though, we need to recognize a fourth element, which is the role of grassroots populism. And if we don't recognize that element, I think that's the cause of the estrangement between conservatives who work and live in the Beltway and conservatives throughout the country at large.
At the end of last week, I attended a very interesting colloquium at the Heritage Foundation that brought together a number of libertarian-leaning conservatives and a number of new right conservatives who have their sort of fingers on the pulse of populism. Kevin, what is your view of fusionism in the 21st century?
Well, to start with a bit of a strange metaphor, I'm a novice woodworker, and I'm currently working on refinishing this stool. And so this is very fitting, actually, at least in my mind. You can tell me in 1 minute if this is true. And so fusionism is, and I think present tense, I think Matt is entirely right, a noble objective. But just as is the case with the stool that I'm refinishing for my wife, we have to understand that for our stool as a conservative movement, to Matt's point about a coalition, we have to be willing, each of us who gravitates to one of those precious legs has to be willing to understand that the political circumstances, the social circumstances, the economic circumstances have changed. Our national security conservatives have to understand, we're, as you might know, having this conversation at Heritage, that we don't have the money as a nation state to be interventionist, even if we wanted to be. Those of us who gravitate to the social conservative stool, but even those of us who don't want to be assigned to one of those stools, would say, we recognize we've lost, for now, the debate on same-sex marriage. That is a matter for culture upstream of politics and policy. Doesn't mean we're going to stop talking about it in our churches, in institutions of civil society. Our libertarian-minded friends have to understand that there are examples of excesses of the free market, like big tech. And we as conservatives, because remember, this is a conservative stool, have to be willing to use the tools of the state when we're in power to do so. And I was going to add a fourth leg, but Matt already did, and that's the leg of populists. And that's going to make the stool, to his point about winning elections, a lot more stable. But I'll finish with this. I think we have an excellent example of that stool already being rebuilt. And it's Ron DeSantis' decision to take on Disney. That's the future of the conservative movement.
Great. On that point, let's start taking a few questions from the audience, and please keep your question brief and in the form of a question with a question mark. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. Name is Raynard Jackson, and I'm a graduate of Oral Roberts University, and I used to work for Old Man Bush. That's what we call him, the father. So he plucked me out of obscurity in St. Louis, and I've been up here ever since, for better or for worse. The question I have for the panel is, when I look at the conservative movement, I'm kind of reminded of, and most of you guys are too young to remember this TV show, the Flintstones cartoon and the Jetsons. I see no blacks in the past in the conservative movement, and I see no blacks in the future in the conservative movement. And which is a shame, because Rush Limbaugh and I used to always have this conversation about, Rush would always come up to me, Jackson, there's a growing move of conservatism in the black community. I said, Rush, you're full of crap. Blacks have always been conservative. Conservatives are just incompetent when it comes to communicating with the black community. So the question I want to ask the panel is there a role for blacks in the conservative movement today and in the future? And then to Yoram, I have a specific question. Do you understand that your whole premise of as conservatives, we must rediscover the Anglo-American roots of conservatism? Are you aware of how that sounds and looks to black folks? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Yoram, take us away.
Well, look, I certainly don't want to pretend that I'm aware of how things sound to the black community, and I, as somebody who organizes big national conferences and international conferences, I'm very sympathetic to the. Well, you said this very gently. I'll say it a little bit less gently. I'm very sympathetic to anybody who comes and says, how many blacks are in your Rolodex? Okay, because this is I've experienced this. My conferences are a coalition of many different organizations, and when you press that question, how many blacks are in your Rolodexes? Generally, people start telling you about, well, we're colorblind, so we don't, right? So look, this is something that I really think conservatives have to overcome. Colorblind is nowhere near good enough. I write this in my book, that justice depends on political leadership, national leadership, being able to understand each of the communities that are supposed to be in coalition where they are, understanding what their actual needs are and what their actual problems are. And if you don't know how to give honor to a particular community, to its actual needs and its actual hardships, then they're not going to be with you, right? This is about honor. This is about honoring the black community which deserves it, and finding out what is it that needs to be done. But the first step is those Rolodexes. You can't look at them and say this is a colorblind Rolodex. You have to say everyone who is in a leadership position in conservatism should be saying, my Rolodex does not involve outreach to the Black community. It's my job to go and find people who are willing to talk to me and tell me what they think. So I hope I heard that correctly, and I think I just agree with the premise.
Let's see what Matthew and Kevin would like to add on this.
Well, just briefly, I try to give due respect in my book to the Black conservative tradition, which is also very long and part of American history. And Yoram was talking about what 25-year-olds read in conservative circles. I have encountered young people from every walk of life who say that the most important thinker that they have ever read is Thomas Sowell. So do the Black Americans have a place in this movement? They better. And should the Black conservative tradition be looked to? Absolutely. Where we go from here is something you and I were talking about earlier. That, I think, is the question. And that is the road that we have to walk down.
And Mr. Jackson, I love your question. So 2 quick but hopefully important points. The first is dealing with different arenas. The first is the arena of thinking. To Matt's point, we have to, as conservatives, regardless of our skin color, recognize the totality of our intellectual tradition in history. And I could keep you here for a couple of hours talking about, here's the Kirkian coming out, going back to Rome, and that really underlying the Anglo-American tradition, which you challenge. There are a lot of people of color in that tradition. We don't talk about that, right? We have to do a better job of that. People who would come to events like this, which means we have to read more and we have to be willing to have these conversations, right? But the second was, we have to do what only a small number of conservative candidates do. Most recently and successfully, Governor Youngkin in Virginia did. He went to parts of Virginia where he was told Republicans don't go to ask for votes. That's the most ridiculous, un-American, condescending thing we can understand. So those of us who spend some time in our private capacities advising conservative candidates, giving them money, require them to go ask for those votes. Because, to Matt's point, given the shared tradition, those votes are there to be had.
Yeah, quick. I was Ron DeSantis' senior advisor for governor in 2018 in Florida. To this day, he's one of the best candidates I've ever worked for when it came to the Black community. Right?
Thank you. Next question.
I grew up as something of a classical liberal, or an old Whig, and it was really going to Berkeley that brought out the conservative in me. And I've always viewed liberalism in its traditional sense as something of an ironic ceasefire, but just looking at reality and some wonderful academic work has shown that it isn't really as ironic as we thought that it was. So my question is, to what degree does this sort of principled particularism, but especially Dr. Hazony, you were advocating, how well do you believe that that is going to be able to protect principled difference, especially within America, but also abroad?
Who'd like to take that?
I think that we need to. This is actually. I think your question continues the previous question, in a way. I think that we need to stop looking at society as constructed out of piles and piles and piles of individuals who only come together to have a state above them. That's not what society looks like. Society is constructed out of loyalty groups, tribes, parties, factions who are loyal to one another. And if you want them in the coalition, then you need to give them honor. They also need to give honor to one another if the country's going to hold together. And I think that liberalism, which is liberalism is a worldview that begins with the assertion that individual human beings are perfectly free and perfectly equal. And it doesn't have anything to say. It does not then proceed to say, oh, and by the way, about those tribes and factions and how to keep them together. It's not there. But the conservative tradition, going all the way back to the Bible, has a great deal to do, a great deal to say about how you bring together disparate tribes. How you bring to the 12 tribes of Israel are very different from one another, and they war against one another. They bitterly hate one another. The Bible is a book about how you make peace among those tribes, and that lesson echoes in subsequent millennia as Western nations learn this lesson. It is a conservative lesson. I think we have the resources to do it. I think that liberalism actually makes it hard for us to understand what our job is here.
So we have time for about 2 more questions. So go ahead.
I'm Matt Lannon, and I'm a student at the Catholic University of America here in DC, and as well as a member of the Young Americans for Freedom. And my question is, how do we reinvigorate those mediating institutions that you, Dr. Roberts, were talking about that have a profound impact on our social lives when many, like the Catholic Church, lost their political will?
Gosh, what a hard question, Matt. I can tell you're a smart guy. Heritage would like to hire you one day. But I'm just buying time to think of a good answer. It's no, all kidding aside, it's hard. It's the hardest part of our work. But that's why we have to do it, because it's the one that will bear the greatest fruit, require the greatest work. I mean, that's biblical. We understand that. Our Jewish brothers understand that too. But I'm going to say something that not everyone always agrees with. It means we have to stop wasting time on institutions that are too far gone. And I recommend to a lot of donors around the country, and I don't mean this relative to giving heritage money. I mean this as someone who started a K-12 school that was, quote unquote, reactionary to Catholic schools that were not even Catholic, led a Catholic college that's in that tradition. So you know where I am on this, that we're wasting too much time on our alma maters, even if they have big endowments, by trying to redeem them. And the John Senior in me would say, let them figure that out. Let's go start new ones that challenge them, that are disruptive innovators. That's a very conservative project. But sometimes, this is getting to the second point, sometimes people will say, well, that's not conservative at all. You're not participating in supporting your alma mater, which has done all of this good. No doubt it's done a lot of good, right? But the point is, it's very conservative, and Yoram makes this point very eloquently in the introduction of his book. Part of our conservative project in that long tradition of 2,500 years, 3,000 years, is having the courage, having the mettle to say, that didn't work. That policy didn't work. We, with all the best intentions, tried to apply such and such and it didn't work. That institution is no longer right for this. And so we have to be willing as conservatives to find those gaps, to find our own abilities, our own capabilities unique to those arenas and lean in. That may mean starting a challenger to a Rotary Club chapter. It may mean starting a school. I gravitate to educational things. It may mean one day having a new right-of-center political party. I just say that as a historian. I'm a conservative before I'm a capital R Republican, right? But that means that if, in fact, we want to see that fruit in our lifetimes, we have to get started today.
So I'd like to try to get in the last 3 questions, so keep them brief. Yes, sir.
I'm going to make mine brief. For all you 3, what is the biggest problem America is facing currently? That's it.
I'll start. The lack of religiosity, defined by every metric, which has led far too many conservatives not to defend what a man is and what a woman is.
I mean, it's behind what Kevin is saying, but it's the same problem America's been facing for decades, and it's the collapse of the family. And the problem is no one knows what to do about it. And to institution building, whether you're going to, before you start a school or a new church, or start a family, that would help a lot.
I agree.
Next question.
love the philosophy of Hebrew scripture and the virtue of nationalism. I bring it up in Torah study all the time, and I get pounded for it. My question is much more practical, and that is, without the 2016 election and Trump's victory, would you people even have a platform here to talk, or would we even have a DeSantis?
Matt, you want to start?
I personally think probably, maybe there'd be fewer people here, but it's important. And there's no question that Trump's election reinvigorated the right and led to a lot of debates that have added new energy to it.
Crucial. I mean, agree with Matt, but let me just say this as a postscript. Populism has always been part of conservatism, and I don't mean this to be denigrating at all to President Trump, whose policies and vigor I really appreciate. But some leader was going to emerge, and I'm grateful that he emerged at a time when we weren't expecting someone to do that, because I do agree with Matt, there wouldn't have been all of these people in this room.
I agree.
I will just add that I was editor of the American Conservative magazine during the Obama years, and as someone who's also been involved with ISI, and now as the editor of Modern Age, there certainly would be fora for the kind of serious conversation that we're having on the stage right now. They certainly would not have received as much spotlight as they have since Donald Trump came on the scene. But I think these conversations have been percolating for a while, and in fact, all the thinkers on this stage have been toiling in the vineyards for quite some time. So with that, we'll go to the last question.
My question is for Dr. Hazony, and it is not at all brief, so you can address whichever part of it you see fit. You mentioned in the first part of your book, though you've brought it up in other places, you define conservatism, and you mentioned that it's a wish to return to as close to you can before things went wrong. I'm paraphrasing it badly, but it's along those lines. I have two kind of questions based off of that. One, would you say then that this can be a universal definition, given that, we've talked here about the Anglo-American tradition, but it's certainly possible to envision places either that don't have a tradition as intellectually rich as the Anglo-American tradition, or which we might not view as beneficent? And then two, if you have any comment on how to kind of pinpoint what it is that you return to, because a lot of conversations about how things have gone wrong in America, people can kind of trace it back to different points. People say the 60s or the 50s or the Enlightenment or whatever, but it sort of works such that things build on top of each other. And so I'm wondering if you have any comment on that.
Well, look, I hesitate to make sort of sweeping statements about but what all human societies are like, since my knowledge of all human societies is limited. I can tell you that I have a pretty good grasp of two related but basically independent conservative traditions: the Anglo-American tradition and the Jewish tradition, and both of these traditions clearly work, I think, in the following way. There are moments of mustering of strength and energy and creativity that set things for a time, for some number of generations, sometimes it's centuries, and then there's an inevitable winding down. And there always comes a conservative moment. These are both conservative societies that are trying to conserve, but in spite of the fact that they're trying to conserve and transmit, there's always eventually a winding down. Things lose their sharpness and their clarity. And the great figures and the great generations and times in both of these traditions are generations when you can look back and see that towering people stepped forward to say this is wound down and we need to restore it, and they select, Selden and Burke and the other thinkers in this tradition are very clear that there is no such thing as a tradition that doesn't include corrupted and decadent and mistaken things in it, which means that at those moments, there is a selection that takes place. Now, I could give you some rules of thumb. Probably would just take too long. But just for example, Burke is adamant that conservatism is not that this tradition is not about yelling stop to prevent change from taking place. That's just not it. He and his predecessors, they say change is inevitable. The question when we're dealing with conservation and transmission is, when change is taking place, what do we repair so that the heart of the thing comes to a new beginning and is restored? The word restoration is crucial in these kinds of discussions. That these conservative thinkers are not looking for a revolution; they're looking for a restoration, which means we have to find a moment where things were working pretty well. You're right. It's very difficult to get consensus on that, but we have a lot of pressure on us right now to get consensus on that. And Burke's guidance is, not to go back to to some age that's 1,000 years ago that you don't even know really what happened then, but to trace it only as far back as you need to see where a particular mistake has led to disaster. Go back there and start from there. So it's it's not a wild reconstruction of an imaginary past. It's a prudent reliance on recent ancestors who knew some things that we no longer know.
Let me also offer Matthew and Kevin about 30 seconds apiece for a final thought.
I've been encouraged by the conversation tonight and the quality of the questions. The three of us did a conversation in another city recently, and I was left so depressed at the end of it that I rushed to the bar. But at the end of this conversation, I'm enlivened and informed. So let me just applaud you all before you applaud us. And I think part of that is the number of young people that I see in this audience. And if there will be a conservative future, it is on you, because even Yoram and I are getting old now.
Speak for yourselves, my friends. But I would propose we rush to the bar in celebration, given the optimism. I would say this, Dan, and thank you for moderating this and for all of your great work. This will sound a little silly, and it may be the parent coming out. We as conservatives, especially conservatives who operate in this town, need to remember that one of our defining characteristics is gratitude, and expressing that. Gratitude for the inheritance we have culturally and philosophically. Gratitude for the ability as conservatives to have conversations like this where there are clearly differences of opinion. We can ask hard questions, but bound by the customs of many ages and different peoples, we can sit here and say, in spite of all the challenges, we're still optimistic. God bless you.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you to our panel. So.